The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like insects trapped in glass, casting everything in that particular shade of green that only hospitals could manufacture. Sacred Heart Hospital in Norfolk smelled like antiseptic layered over burnt coffee and something underneath both that Rachel Torres had learned long ago to stop identifying: the smell of bodies under stress, adrenaline secreting through skin, fear metabolizing into sweat. She clocked in at 6:06 on a Tuesday morning in March, and nobody watching her pin her name badge to her crisp new scrubs would have known she'd spent the previous 18 years moving through rooms exactly like this one, except those rooms had been in Fallujah and Helmand Province and half a dozen places the State Department had officially decided she'd never been. Her hands moved without thinking as she organized her supply cart in the cardiac unit, checking catheter gauges with the kind of precision that betrayed training no temporary hospital nurse should possess. 14-gauge angiocath needles arranged by size. Dressing packs stacked in descending order. Every movement economical, nothing wasted, nothing out of place. The boots beneath her scrubs were the problem. Worn leather, cracked from desert sand that no amount of cleaning could fully remove, laces knotted tight enough to cut off circulation. Combat boots. She'd tried civilian shoes 3 times. Lasted 1 shift each before her feet rejected them like a body rejecting a foreign organ. The boots stayed. They were the only piece of Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres she'd been permitted to keep when the Navy erased her name from every database and ordered her to disappear into civilian life like she'd been classified out of existence. Dr. Sterling stood in his office on the 2nd floor, separated from the cardiac unit by glass panels he kept meticulously clean, and watched her through the opening in the nursing station. He was the kind of man who'd learned early that confidence could substitute for competence, silver hair styled with the precision of someone who'd mastered the performance of authority without ever actually earning it. 62 years old, 2 ex-wives, a $480,000 salary that somehow didn't account for the Omega Seamaster watch on his left wrist or the Tesla parked in the administrator's spot. His eyes were the pale blue of shallow water, and they followed Rachel with the cold calculation of a man recognizing a threat before he fully understood what it was. Rachel moved through patient charts with the methodical focus of someone reading threat assessments. Room 347 was her 4th stop on rounds. Commander James Halston lay in post-op recovery from a cardiac valve replacement, his surgery completed 14 hours prior, his vital signs stable, his left forearm bearing a tattoo that read Torres in military block letters 2 inches tall. She'd know that tattoo anywhere. She'd watched him get it inked at a forward operating base 3 hours before the extraction in Baghdad, 3 miles of hostile fire and his compound fracture and her hands doing things hands weren't supposed to do to keep him breathing until the Black Hawk arrived. Now his eyes were dulled by morphine, pupils blown wide, and they moved past her face without a flicker of recognition. The tattoo meant something to him. She meant nothing. She checked his for line with hands that appeared steady because she'd learned that trembling was a luxury she couldn't afford anymore. The tremor that ran through her fingers was hypervigilance, not uncertainty, the baseline electrical hum of someone whose body had never quite accepted that she was safe. She'd pulled it off though, the integration. 14 months at various hospitals across 3 states, always temporary contracts, always minimal background checks for traveling nurses, always disappearing after 6 weeks before anyone could ask questions she couldn't answer. Sacred Heart was temporary too. 3 weeks, maybe 4 if the staffing shortage held. She'd stay invisible. That was the contract she'd made with the Navy, with the State Department, with whatever agency had put her name through a shredder at Langley. Stay invisible and they stay away from the people you love. The premium medical equipment violated her like a wrong note in a song she'd been hearing in her sleep. She stood in the supply room, the isolated corner of the cardiac unit, away from observation, and examined the billings on the cabinet. Premium catheters. Unnecessary. Sacred Heart could use standard 7 French Swan-Ganz catheters for 90% of these cases, but someone had arranged for the deluxe 8 French thermodilution models instead, bumping cost per unit from $340 to $890. She ran the numbers backward in her head the way she'd been trained to calculate ammunition consumption and water ration allocation. 43 procedures a month. $60 difference per unit. Multiply by 12 months. $28,800 annually per physician if they all used the premium equipment. 3 physicians in the cardiac unit with the authority to order them. $86,400. But Sterling was the director. He'd have the most influence on procurement. $40,000 a month if the pattern held. Her hands moved over the cabinet, cataloging, not touching. She didn't know yet that she'd just signed her own execution order. Dr. Sterling made the phone call from his office at 11:23 that morning, 14 minutes after Rachel had left the supply room. His voice carried the warmth of a man who'd learned to weaponize charm, who understood that cruelty worked better when it wore a smile. "Jennifer? It's Robert Sterling at Sacred Heart. Listen, I'm having some concerns about the new temp nurse in my unit. Torres." "Yeah. No formal complaints yet, but her resume has some gaps and I'm wondering if those references she provided might warrant a phone call from our end. Just to be thorough." He paused, listening. "I appreciate that. Yes, send me whatever you find. I like to know who I'm working with, you understand." He hung up and opened his calendar, selecting a specific date 3 weeks out, and created an event titled Contract Renewal, Torres, Likely Termination. Then he walked to the staff lounge where nurses rotated in and out during break cycles. The lounge smelled like the microwave nobody ever actually cleaned and industrial-strength air freshener failing to mask it. Rachel was retrieving a bottle of water from the refrigerator when Sterling entered, moving with the unself-conscious ease of a man who'd never experienced discomfort in any space he occupied. He was flanked by 2 mid-level administrators and 1 cardiac nurse, witnesses, though nobody called them that. His voice reached the tone of performative warmth, the kind that sounded like concern but read like predation. "You know what, folks? I'm going to make a little wager," Sterling said, and the room shifted in that way rooms did when hierarchy entered the space. "I'll lay even money, and I'll throw in $100 of my own money to sweeten the pot, that our new temporary nurse here, Ms. Torres, won't last the week." He turned to her with that smile, the one that didn't reach his eyes. "Nothing personal. It's just that the cardiac unit is demanding. Most people crack under the pressure. I give you until Friday." Silence. The other nurses shifted their weight, suddenly interested in their sandwiches. Rachel stood very still with the water bottle in her hand. Her jaw clenched, a single millimeter of movement, the only permission she allowed herself. "You think I'll quit?" Her voice came out level as a flat line, which was the point. No anger. No offense. No tremor. Just a statement of fact, delivered with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst a human body and human institution could do to you. "I think the work will exceed your capabilities," Sterling said. He was smiling now, really smiling, the expression of a man who'd successfully drawn blood. "But I'd love to be wrong. Prove me wrong, Ms. Torres." She uncapped the water bottle with mechanical precision and took a single sip. Set it down on the counter. Looked at him with eyes the color of a stormy Atlantic, the kind of eyes that had watched people die and had catalogued that data without breaking, and said 7 words that would become famous later when everyone had time to understand what they meant. "I've picked up heavier things than your ego, doctor." She walked out of the lounge. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Dr. Sterling's phone began ringing by 2:17 that afternoon with confirmation that Rachel Torres' listed references didn't exist. Her employment history before 18 months ago was blank. Her social security number had been flagged for security reasons by someone at the federal level, and the call had triggered automatic protocols that Sterling would have found fascinating if he'd understood what he was actually looking at. He didn't. He only understood that the gap made her vulnerable, and vulnerable people could be pressured into leaving. He'd done it before. He'd do it again. Rachel spent her evening on the porch of the small house she rented in the suburbs, a 2-bedroom with white shutters and the kind of anonymity only rental properties could provide. She didn't go back to the memory, not yet. That was the rule. Remember only what you needed to survive the next shift, and file away the rest for the therapy session she never attended and the counselor she never called. The combat boot sat beside her on the step, and she ran her thumb over the worn leather. 3 miles through Jolin District. Halston's weight against her shoulder. His blood on her sleeve. The way his eyes had found hers in the Black Hawk and said thank you without words because words weren't allowed for what she'd done, where she'd done it, or why. Inside the house, she had no photographs. No memorabilia. No evidence that Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres had ever existed. Just a woman named Rachel who worked temporary contracts at hospitals and was learning to be invisible so well that even she was starting to forget what she looked like. The night pressed against the windows like something alive, and the rain began, that particular March rain that sounded like small fingers tapping on glass, insistent and patient. The rain continued through Rachel's second shift, the relentless March tapping against the break room windows as she sat alone with her coffee, watching the morning staff trickle in for rounds. She kept her eyes on the steam rising from her cup, a small, controlled thing, when Dr. Sterling pushed through the door, his tailored coat still damp from the parking lot. He carried the kind of confidence that came from never hearing the word no, the kind that filled a room like expensive cologne. "Morning, everyone," he announced, pulling a $20 bill from his wallet and slapping it on the break room table with deliberate ceremony. The sound cut through conversation like a scalpel. "I'm starting a pool. How long before our temporary hire here realizes she's out of her depth?" Rachel didn't look up. She knew exactly what was happening. This was stage 2 of his campaign, public humiliation designed to make her flinch, to crack the composure he'd already decided was arrogance. Around the table, nurses exchanged glances. Some looked sympathetic. Most looked away. "I give her a week," Sterling continued, his voice carrying that performative warmth that precedes cruelty. "Any takers? Come on, someone here has to think I'm right." A charge nurse, Patricia, who had smiled at Rachel on the first day, dropped a bill on the table without meeting her eyes. Then another nurse. Then another. Sterling marked a calendar on the whiteboard in blue marker, Torres departure countdown, day 1. He underlined it twice, his handwriting aggressive and certain. Rachel finished her coffee. She rinsed the cup at the sink, her movements precise as military drill, and when she turned to leave, Sterling stepped directly into her path. "Where's the fire, Torres? Don't you want to place a bet on yourself? Might be the only sure money you make here." She took one measured breath. Felt the familiar weight of invisible burden settling across her shoulders like a tactical vest. And said nothing, because people who underestimate quiet women usually deserve what comes next. 2 days later, she balanced her lunch tray in the cafeteria line, turkey sandwich, apple, black coffee, and moved through the crowd of staff members eating at tables scattered throughout the space. 60 people. Maybe more. She'd learned to count exits instinctively, a habit from Baghdad that civilian life hadn't managed to erase. The cafeteria buzzed with the particular energy of a hospital at midday, doctors discussing case loads, nurses comparing shift notes, the smell of overheated vegetables and industrial disinfectant mixing in the recycled air. She didn't see Sterling until he was already moving. He came from her left side, timing it perfectly so the collision looked accidental to anyone not paying attention. But Rachel had trained under circumstances where you learn to read intention in body weight distribution, in the angle of an approach, in the precise moment someone stopped pretending to be harmless. She felt it coming a half second before impact. His shoulder caught her tray perfectly. The turkey sandwich arced through the air like a slow projectile. The apple tumbled end over end. The coffee cup followed, spilling its contents across white tile in a spreading brown river that looked like something else entirely. The tray clattered against the floor with a sound like gunshot report, and every conversation in the cafeteria died. 60 staff members fell absolutely silent. Sterling didn't even look down. "Oh, how clumsy," he said, his voice loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Better clean that up before someone slips, sweetheart. Wouldn't want another accident today." Rachel knelt to gather the pieces. She collected the turkey sandwich first, the bread soggy with coffee. Then the apple, rolling it back toward her with careful fingers. The broken pieces of the cup took longer, small white shards scattered across the tile like bone fragments, and she retrieved them one by one, her movements methodical, controlled, each motion the product of training that taught her that panic was a luxury and vulnerability was a weapon pointed at her own chest. A single tear escaped her left eye as she knelt. She didn't wipe it away immediately. Instead, she let it fall, feeling it trace a path down her cheek as she continued gathering debris. Her hand steady. Her breathing regulated. Her voice, when it came, level as a flatline monitor at 3 a.m. "I've picked up heavier things than your ego, Doctor." She said it quietly. Not a shout. Not a plea. A statement of fact delivered with the kind of certainty that only comes from having really, truly picked up heavier things. The kind of heavy that leaves permanent marks. The kind of weight that teaches you that dignity isn't something people give you, it's something you keep for yourself, no matter what they throw on the floor. She wiped her eye then. One motion. No flinching. No breaking eye contact with his expensive Italian shoes. The silence stretched. Sterling's jaw tightened visibly, the muscle along his chin clenching like a fist. This one didn't break easily. Which made her infinitely more dangerous than she'd been before. By that evening, Sterling had escalated. He sat in his office making phone calls, his door closed but his voice carrying through the thin hospital walls to anyone who cared to listen. First call was to Gerald Hutchins, the hospital board chairman, a man whose underwater mortgage Sterling had personally refinanced 3 years ago when the housing market collapsed. A favor. The kind of favor that created permanent leverage. "Gerald, I wanted to flag something before it becomes a liability," Sterling said, his tone the careful concern of a peer offering friendly warning. "Our temporary nursing assignment from the staffing agency? I'm seeing some irregularities. Questionable decisions. Scope of practice issues. And honestly, I can't verify her references properly. The other hospitals seem evasive. The other hospitals were naval intelligence cover identities. They would, of course, be evasive. They would sound evasive in exactly the way that made someone like Sterling believe he'd discovered a conspiracy." Second call was direct to the 2 hospitals where Rachel's fabricated identity had been established. Sterling was careful here, friendly, collegial, one physician checking on a professional reference. "Just doing our due diligence before bringing someone onto our cardiac unit. Your records on Rachel Torres show she worked critical care, but I'm seeing some gaps in documentation. Wondering if you could speak to her clinical judgment." The voice on the other end, naval intelligence operator trained for exactly this scenario, said carefully that they had concerns about her independent decision-making. Could not recommend without reservations. Had suggested she seek further training before taking independent roles. It was beautiful work, actually. Not crude intimidation. Not loud accusations. Just the soft, poisonous seeding of doubt. The whisper campaign designed to undermine without leaving fingerprints. By the time Sterling filed the paperwork requesting an outside compliance audit, the entire nursing staff had heard something. The story shifted with each retelling, but the core remained consistent: the temp nurse wasn't properly credentialed. The temp nurse had made questionable calls. The temp nurse couldn't be trusted in critical situations. That night, in room 347, Commander James Halston lay recovering from routine cardiac valve surgery, morphine keeping the worst of the pain at bay but leaving his mind fractured, unreliable. The IED blast in Baghdad had taken pieces of him, memories mostly, the kind that don't show up on imaging but haunt you in the 3 a.m. hours when the medication wears off and you're left alone with gaps in your own history. He'd been in bad shape when they pulled him from the rubble. He remembered that much. And then, nothing. Just the German medical facility. Just waking up in hospital beds with half his life missing. Rachel entered for evening vitals, her clipboard in hand, her movements efficient enough to not disturb his rest if he was sleeping. He wasn't. His eyes tracked her from the moment she crossed the threshold, and when she reached for the blood pressure cuff, her eyes caught on his forearm. The tattoo was unmissable. Torres inked in block letters beside his seal trident, the skin around it puckered with burn scars that spoke of healing that had been painful and incomplete. The kind of scarring that came from blast trauma. Rachel's hand trembled as she wrapped the cuff around his bicep. You know what it means?" Halston asked, his voice rough from the intubation tube, still carrying that rasp that took days to disappear. "The name on my arm? You keep staring at it like you recognize it." "Someone who mattered," Rachel said quietly, her voice steady despite the tremor she couldn't quite hide from her hands. "Can't remember who." He studied her with morphine-dulled confusion, his pupils still responding sluggishly to light, his face the particular mask of a man trying to assemble missing pieces into something coherent. "That's what they keep telling me. Someone who mattered. Someone saved my life 3 miles through hostile fire and then just vanished. The Navy won't talk about it. Records are sealed. Sometimes I wake up trying to remember a face and coming up empty." Rachel documented his blood pressure, 120/78, elevated but reasonable post-surgical, and her hand moved to check his drainage tubing, the thin catheter site just below his left shoulder. The output had decreased from the first post-op day, which was normal. Except she'd been tracking his hemoglobin trends, the numbers they drew from his labs each morning, and something didn't align properly. "Sometimes the people who save us stay with us in ways we don't understand," she told him, and meant it like a prayer for someone she'd carried through terrain that tried to kill them both. "Even when we can't remember their faces." Halston closed his eyes, and she finished the check in silence, her mind already spinning through the numbers, the data, the slow-growing certainty that something was wrong with his recovery in ways that wouldn't show up until it became catastrophic. And that's when the real nightmare began. The monitor's alarm cut through the ward at 0200 hours like a scalpel through silence. Rachel was 3 rooms away, checking post-op vitals on Mrs. Chen, when the sound registered, not the standard rhythm alert but the cascading panic tone that meant blood pressure instability. She was moving before her conscious mind caught up, muscle memory from 17 years of combat medicine overriding the exhaustion that had settled into her bones after Sterling's latest humiliation that afternoon. Room 347. Commander Halston. She pushed through the door to find him sitting upright, his massive frame rigid against the pillows, gasping like a man drowning in air. His skin had taken on that peculiar grey-tinged pallor she'd seen before, in field hospitals, in medevac helicopters, in the moments just before bodies failed. The monitor showed the story, blood pressure dropping like a stone, heart rate climbing past 140, jugular veins distended so severely they looked like ropes straining against his neck. "Can't breathe," he choked, his eyes wide with the primal terror of a man whose body was betraying him in the worst possible way. Rachel's hands were already moving. She hit the code button with the side of her fist, one sharp, authoritative gesture, and crossed to his bedside in 3 quick strides. Her mind wasn't thinking in hospital protocols anymore. It was calculating in combat medicine, symptoms, timeline, intervention window. Cardiac tamponade. Post-surgical pericardial effusion. The bleed she'd flagged in his labs yesterday when she'd noticed the subtle shift in his troponin levels and the way his CVP line readings had started creeping upward. The bleed Sterling had dismissed with a wave of his hand because Rachel Torres was just a temp, just a contracted nurse, just someone to be managed and removed from the equation. The problem with removing experienced combat medics from equations was that they tended to solve themselves in ways you didn't anticipate. "I'm calling the cardiothoracic surgeon," the night shift charge nurse called from the doorway, already on her phone, her voice sharp with the controlled panic of someone following protocol. Dr. Sterling appeared 70 seconds later, still buttoning his shirt, his hair disheveled, his expression moving through surprise to calculation with the speed of a man who understood immediately that this emergency was happening on his watch and that his response would be documented. He took in the scene, the monitor readouts, the distended neck veins, Halston's cyanotic lips, and Rachel saw the exact moment when his doctor's training kicked in, pushing aside whatever schemes had occupied his mind during his interrupted sleep. "We need to wait for the surgeon," Sterling said, moving to the bedside, his voice steady. "Let's get 2 large bore 4s running, fluid bolus, get him oxygen at 15 liters." The words were correct. The protocol was textbook. And it would take 15 minutes for the surgeon to arrive from home. It would take minutes for Commander Halston's heart to stop. Rachel was already pulling the emergency cart toward the bed, her hands precise and efficient. She knew what needed to happen. She'd done it before. She'd done it in 115-degree heat with mortars landing 2 kilometers out, with nothing but field instruments and the kind of focus that either saved lives or ended them. "He needs a pericardiocentesis," Rachel said. Not a question. Not a request. Just a statement of fact delivered in the same voice she might have used to order ammunition. Sterling's head snapped toward her. "You are not authorized to perform invasive procedures. Step back." "That's an order." Rachel didn't step back. She'd been stepped on by better men than this one. She'd carried a dying SEAL commander through hostile fire while rounds sparked off the rubble around her, and whatever authority Sterling thought he wielded meant less than nothing against the fact that Commander Halston's oxygen saturation was dropping into the 70s and his blood pressure was barely holding at 68 systolic. She made her choice the way soldiers make their most important choices, with complete clarity and no hesitation. She stepped around Sterling like he was furniture, opened the pericardiocentesis kit with her left hand while her right hand was already palpating Halston's ribs, finding the landmarks, locating the xiphoid process with the kind of muscle memory that didn't fade even when everything else in your life was being systematically dismantled. Through the glass of the room's external wall, the entire night shift cardiac floor had stopped moving. Nurses pressed their faces against the transparent barrier. The resident frozen mid-medication drawer. The respiratory therapist's hands paused on the ventilator settings. Everyone watching. Everyone waiting. Everyone about to see whether the temp nurse was about to commit career suicide or save a man's life. Rachel's hands moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had performed this procedure in conditions that would have broken most surgical teams. No ultrasound guidance, just palpation and feel and the kind of bone-deep knowledge that came from repetition under fire. She positioned the long needle below Halston's xiphoid process at a 45-degree angle, advanced it toward the pericardial sac while her left hand guided an ultrasound probe across his chest, watching the screen, watching the needle path, feeling through her fingertips for the moment when the pericardium gave way beneath the tip. Halston made a sound between a gasp and a sob. Sterling had stepped back now, his phone already in his hand, already dialing, already beginning the process of documentation and defensiveness and whatever legal architecture he would need to construct to survive what he was witnessing. The needle advanced. The ultrasound image showed the fluid-filled sac surrounding Halston's heart like a vice. Rachel watched the screen and felt the subtle change in resistance as the needle pierced the membrane. Then dark blood, burgundy and thick, began filling the syringe as she pulled the plunger back with her right hand, releasing the crushing pressure that had been strangling his heart. 40 ccs of fluid. 60. 80. Halston's color changed first. The cyanotic pallor began draining away, replaced by something closer to normal flesh tone. His breathing deepened, became less desperate. The monitor showed the change immediately, blood pressure climbing, heart rate dropping, the physiology of a heart finally given space to beat properly. The entire procedure took 40 seconds. Rachel withdrew the needle, held pressure over the puncture site with a gauze pad, and turned to look at the monitor one more time. Sinus rhythm. Strong pulse. O2 saturation climbing past 92. Through the glass wall, the night shift was still frozen in place. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The room held a silence so thick you could have performed surgery in it. Sterling was backing out of the room now, phone pressed to his ear, his voice already changing to something lower and more urgent as he began making calls to the hospital board chairman, to whatever allies he'd cultivated, to whatever defensive structures he thought might shield him from the disaster he'd just witnessed. He passed the charge nurse in the doorway without meeting her eyes, and Rachel saw the calculation on his face shifting already, recalibrating, understanding with the speed of a predator that his game had just entered a dangerous new phase. Rachel turned back to Halston, who was breathing steadily now, his panic beginning to fade into the kind of exhaustion that came from having brushed against his own mortality. She placed her hand against his shoulder, not a gesture of comfort, just a medical assessment, feeling the rise and fall of his breathing, noting the return of warmth to his skin. "Rest," she said. "Your heart needed space. It has it now." He nodded, his eyes already beginning to close, the morphine and his own body's crash pushing him toward sleep. She disposed of the kit with mechanical efficiency. Checked his vitals one more time. Made notes in the chart, timestamp, procedure, findings, fluid withdrawn, patient stabilization. Everything by the book, everything documented, everything the kind of evidence that couldn't be argued with or spun into something else. When she stepped out of room 347, 6 pairs of eyes were waiting for her. The charge nurse, Rodriguez, who'd been at Sacred Heart for 8 years, was the first to move. She came forward with the expression of someone who'd just watched the impossible become real. That was. She started, then stopped, looking for a word big enough. That was textbook trauma medicine. I learned from the best, Rachel said quietly. The resident, a third-year surgical resident named Patel who was doing a rotation on the cardiac floor, was already pulling up his phone. I'm documenting what we just saw. That needs to be in writing before Sterling files whatever complaint he's already planning. Rachel understood what they were offering. Witnesses. Documentation. The kind of corroboration that might matter when everything else collapsed. But she also understood that Patel's phone documentation and Rodriguez's testimony wouldn't stop what Sterling was already setting in motion. She'd triggered something in him when she performed that procedure without his authorization, and whatever consequences came from that choice would arrive on their own timeline. She returned to Mrs. Chen's room and finished her vitals check, her hands as steady as they'd been in room 347. The older woman had slept through the entire emergency, undisturbed by the monitors and alarms and the small drama of survival that had unfolded 3 rooms away. Rachel adjusted her full line, checked her oxygen, and made her notes. By 0400 hours, Sterling had filed his report. By 0600 hours, hospital administration was involved. By the time Rachel's shift ended at 0800, security was waiting for her in the charge nurse's station with an expression that suggested they'd been given instructions to maintain professional courtesy while executing something that definitely wasn't professional courtesy at all. Ms. Torres, we need you to come with us, the senior security officer said. He was a large man with kind eyes, and Rachel could tell from his bearing that he hated this part of his job. She knew what was coming. She'd known the moment she stepped around Sterling and advanced that needle into Halston's pericardium. Some choices had only one possible ending. But that wasn't the worst part. The cardiothoracic surgeon arrived at 0347, still buttoning his coat as he reviewed the monitor strips outside room 347. Dr. Marcus Chen, genuine competence, the kind that didn't need to announce itself, studied the crystalline fluid now draining from the pericardial sac into the collection chamber, then looked at Rachel with an expression that moved between shock and respect. 40 seconds, he said quietly, not a question. You performed this in 40 seconds. Rachel didn't answer. She was already documenting vital signs, her hand steady as surgical lasers, her focus absolute. Chen turned to the night charge nurse. Get an EKG. Full cardiac workup. And somebody find me whoever inserted that central line. He looked back at Rachel. That intervention saved his life. 10 more minutes and we'd be doing a surgical evacuation. You know that, right? She nodded once. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song above them. Chen's pager vibrated. He answered it immediately, his expression shifting from gratitude to something harder. Yes, I understand. I'll write my assessment. He hung up without saying goodbye. By 0300, before Rachel had even finished her charting, Dr. Sterling had already made 3 phone calls. The first was to board chairman Robert Hutchins at his home in the Ghent neighborhood, a man who owed Sterling $47,000 in mortgage assistance he could never officially repay. We have a serious liability exposure, Sterling said, his voice carrying manufactured concern. A temporary contract nurse performed an invasive surgical procedure without physician authorization or supervision. She inserted a catheter directly into the pericardial sac, that's the membrane surrounding the heart. If she'd missed by half an inch, she could have perforated the myocardium. We're looking at a wrongful death suit for millions. Hutchins listened. Sterling knew he was listening because he could hear the man's breathing change. I'm recommending immediate termination and a full investigation. I've already contacted compliance. The second call went to Linda Marsh in the risk management office. I need an investigator on this immediately, Sterling said. Practicing beyond scope. Insubordination. She bypassed chain of command during an emergency protocol. Get something on paper. The third call was to the hospital's chief of staff, painting Rachel as the kind of rogue provider who endangered patients and created liability nightmares. By 0600, the narrative was already written. By 0800, it was institutional fact. Hospital security arrived at the nursing station at 0831. 2 uniformed officers, one carrying a clipboard, neither making eye contact with Rachel as she was escorting a patient back to bed after vital signs. Ms. Torres, the taller officer said. You need to come with us. The floor went quiet. Someone's for pump beeped in the sudden silence. Rachel finished documenting the last vital sign, a small act of defiance, or maybe just adherence to protocol, before she looked at the officers. Am I under arrest? No, But your employment has been terminated. We need to escort you from the building. They walked her to her locker like she was a prisoner being released, like her competence and her intervention and the man she'd saved just hours ago didn't matter at all. The morning shift watched. Some looked away. Some looked angry. One nurse, Patricia Chen, no relation to the cardiothoracic surgeon, whispered something to her colleague, and Rachel heard the word bullshit drift across the unit. She didn't respond. The locker door opened with the same smooth motion it always had. She removed her stethoscope, her small trauma shears with the military call sign engraved on the handle, and then she reached for the bottom of the locker where she'd hidden the only thing from her past she could keep, the pair of worn combat boots from Baghdad, scuffed and cracked and irreplaceable. She placed them in a plastic bag without ceremony. An HR director was waiting at the front desk. Rachel had seen her maybe twice since starting the temp assignment. Your employment is terminated effective immediately pending investigation, the woman read from a printed statement, her voice matching the flatness of the words. You'll receive information about contesting this decision by mail. Rachel didn't ask any questions. Asking questions meant fighting, meant defending herself, meant saying out loud that she'd saved a man's life. She couldn't do that. The classified operation that made her invisible in the first place demanded her silence. The parking lot was cold. She sat in her 15-year-old Honda Civic with the plastic bag of combat boots on the passenger seat, the hospital receding in her rearview mirror like something that had never been real. Her hands finally shook as she gripped the steering wheel, but she sat there for 5 minutes until they stopped. Pain was information. Trembling was just data. She'd learned long ago that emotions were things that happened to other people, people who got to have normal lives, people who weren't erased by their government and then erased again by a doctor protecting his kickback scheme. By evening, she was sitting in the waiting room of the VA hospital across town, not as a provider but as a patient seeking psychiatric services she should have sought 3 years ago. The waiting room smelled like antiseptic and old coffee. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, identical to Sacred Heart's, identical to every medical facility she'd ever worked in. Around her sat veterans, a woman with one arm scrolling through her phone, a man with a prosthetic leg staring at nothing, a younger Marine with scarring across his neck that suggested burns or shrapnel or both. Rachel recognized the weight they carried because she carried it too, that particular heaviness that came from having seen the worst humanity could offer and being unable to speak about most of it. A young Marine with a prosthetic leg glanced at her combat boots in the plastic bag and nodded recognition, the kind of nod that said, "I understand, sister." Rachel couldn't meet his eyes. The intake coordinator called her name, Rachel Torres, new patient evaluation. She stood, leaving the plastic bag of boots beside her empty chair, and followed the coordinator down a hallway that looked identical to every other hallway in every other hospital, and she thought about how she'd been made invisible twice now, once by her country, once by a doctor who'd decided that profit was more important than truth. Back at Sacred Heart, Dr. Sterling sat in his office with the door locked, dictating his incident report into a voice recorder. Patient case review, Commander James Halston, date of incident, Dr. Sterling speaking. A temporary contract nurse performed an unauthorized invasive procedure on the above patient without physician supervision or approval, specifically a pericardiocentesis on a post-operative cardiac patient. This procedure is outside the scope of nursing practice and represents a significant deviation from institutional protocols. While the patient survived the immediate crisis, the procedure was conducted without proper assessment, without adequate monitoring, and without adherence to chain of command. He paused, then continued. This behavior constitutes dangerous cowboy medicine and creates substantial liability for the institution. I recommend immediate termination of the contract and referral to the State Nursing Board for investigation of scope violations. He turned off the recorder. His hands were steady. His conscience, which had been successfully compartmentalized for 17 years of kickbacks and inflated billing and unnecessary upgrades to premium medical equipment, remained compartmentalized. He deleted the security footage showing him at his desk during the crisis, the footage that would have proven he'd frozen while a contract nurse saved his patient's life. By 1100, the hospital's risk management team arrived at Sacred Heart with a document bag to collect Rachel's personal effects from her now empty locker, and somewhere across the city, Rachel Torres sat in a VA waiting room surrounded by people whose wounds she'd once treated in forward operating bases she could never speak about, wars she could never describe, operations that had been erased from every official record, and she finally understood that some silences were designed to break you. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't even close to the worst part. What happened next didn't just silence the room. It brought the entire hospital to its knees. Rachel was still loading her personal items into a cardboard box when the hospital entrance doors burst open like someone had kicked them off their hinges. 17-year-old Marcus Torres stood there breathing hard, his lanky frame silhouetted against the afternoon light, clutching something wrapped in faded blue cloth. The box he carried looked ancient, the kind of shadow box that belonged in someone's living room, not in a hospital hallway at 3:38 p.m. on a Tuesday. He spotted his mother near the lockers and moved toward her with the single-minded determination of someone who'd finally found what he'd been searching for his entire life. "Mom." His voice cracked slightly. "They need to see these." Rachel turned, her hand still wrapped around a stack of folded scrubs. Her composure didn't flicker, but something shifted in her eyes, a fraction of a second where the carefully constructed mask showed a hairline fracture. Charge nurse Patricia Chen, who'd been pretending to reorganize supply carts 3 aisles away, stopped moving entirely. 3 other nurses froze mid-conversation. Even the overhead fluorescent lights seemed to pause their endless humming. Marcus opened the shadow box with the reverence of someone opening a tomb. Inside, arranged on dark blue velvet, lay medals. Not a single medal. Not 3. An entire constellation of military citations, each one catching the harsh hospital light like it was throwing off sparks. The ribbons were vivid, red and white stripes, medals on bronze stars, the unmistakable colors of recognition that the vast majority of Americans would walk past without understanding. Patricia's hand moved to her mouth. Her other hand trembled as she lifted the frame from Marcus's hands, bringing it closer to the light. Her voice, when she spoke, sounded like someone reading from a classified document she'd accidentally been given clearance to see. "Navy Achievement Medal," she read aloud, her voice steady but thin. "Bronze Star with Valor." She paused, swallowing hard. Her eyes flickered to Rachel. "Purple Heart." The hallway had gone so quiet you could hear the distant rhythm of the cardiac monitors 3 aisles away. Patricia continued reading, her hand shaking now. "Joint Service Commendation Medal." "And the—" She trailed off, her eyes widening as they fixed on the final medal. "The Defense Superior Service Medal." That was when the elevator at the far end of the corridor dinged softly and Commander James Halston appeared in his wheelchair, pushed by an orderly who immediately recognized the weight of the moment and stepped backward, leaving the commander to propel himself forward on his own. His posture was different now, the post-operative slouch was gone. His shoulders sat squared like a man wearing dress blues to a formal ceremony. His eyes were clear. The morphine haze had lifted completely, burned away by whatever clarity had struck him 3 days ago when a woman he didn't recognize pulled his life back from the edge of a void. When he spoke, his voice carried the parade ground precision of someone who'd spent 22 years commanding men in places where hesitation meant death. "That medal," Halston said, gesturing to the Defense Superior Service Medal, was awarded for leading the extraction that saved 12 Navy SEAL operators. Including me. He rolled forward until he was beside Marcus, his eyes fixed on Patricia. Including 7 men who wouldn't be home right now. 7 men whose kids would be growing up without fathers. All because the woman standing right there, he pointed directly at Rachel, carried me 3 miles through hostile fire in Baghdad when I took shrapnel in my femoral artery, and the only reason I'm alive is because she knew exactly where to apply pressure and exactly what kind of tourniquet would keep me breathing long enough to reach the extraction point. 2 figures had appeared at the far end of the hallway. They moved with the particular gait of federal agents, shoulders squared, badges visible on their belts, the unmistakable presence of people who held the power to ask questions and expect answers. The taller one, a man in his late 40s with salt and pepper hair and a scar along his jawline that suggested he'd been somewhere dangerous before he carried a badge, held up credentials. "I'm Special Agent James Carson, FBI," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel. "We've been investigating Dr. Sterling for the past 6 weeks. Financial irregularities in medical supply procurement totaling approximately $847,000. Kickback arrangements with Med Supply Solutions. And as of this afternoon, we have evidence that he fabricated disciplinary action against a member of this nursing staff to conceal his own criminal conduct." The second agent, younger, female, with eyes that had clearly seen corruption up close, stepped forward. Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres' classified records were declassified 3 days ago as part of a routine archive review. "We received notice this morning." The same day she performed an emergency pericardiocentesis that saved Commander Halston's life for the 2nd time. The Pentagon's timing notifications go to a very specific list. We were on that list. Down the hallway, Dr. Sterling had heard the words FBI and criminal conduct, and something in his chest seized like a fist closing. He was already moving, his gait quickening as he headed toward his office door. His hand reached for the handle. His fingers brushed the metal. "Dr. Sterling," Agent Carson called out, his voice not loud but carrying the weight of authority that couldn't be outrun, "we need to speak with you about those financial irregularities." Sterling's hand froze on the door handle. The tendons in his wrist went rigid. For a moment, just a fraction of a second, he considered running anyway, considered some impossible version of events where he could make it to his computer and delete the security footage before they had a warrant. The staged cafeteria incident. The chart thrown at Rachel's feet. The moment he'd physically blocked her during the emergency when every instinct in his body had screamed that she was about to make him look incompetent. He opened the door and stepped inside his office. He didn't close it. The computer sat on his desk like a judge waiting to deliver a verdict. His fingers hovered over the keyboard for exactly 1 second before he realized the futility of what he was about to attempt. He'd spent 6 years as a cardiac surgeon developing skills that had absolutely no application to the concept of erasing digital evidence. He didn't even know where the security server files were stored. He didn't. The office door opened. Daniel Rodriguez stood there, a man in his 50s with dark hair going gray and the unmistakable bearing of someone who'd worn dress blues for longer than he'd worn a hospital IT director's badge. 2 tours in Fallujah. A Purple Heart he never talked about. And the master access codes to every computer system in Sacred Heart Hospital, because after what he'd seen overseas, he'd learned that you protect your people by knowing exactly who had access to what and when. Rodriguez held up his phone. On the screen was an email timestamp from 4 hours earlier. The subject line read, "For investigation, security footage, targeting of nursing staff." I forwarded everything to the State Medical Board, the Hospital Ethics Committee, and the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division, Rodriguez said quietly. Every frame of footage. Every timestamp. Every incident. He paused, and his voice dropped lower. Fellow veteran being targeted. Full documentation attached. Behind him, Board Chairman Gerald Hutchins appeared, his face carved from stone. Beside Hutchins came CEO Dr. Sarah Okonkwo, her expression a mixture of fury and something else, something that looked like she was calculating how much this scandal was going to cost the hospital in legal fees and reputation damage. "The FBI has recordings of your phone calls," Hutchins said, and his voice sounded like a man who'd aged 10 years in the last 6 hours. "Including the one where you asked me to bury concerns about supply billing in exchange for mortgage assistance." Hutchins's jaw clenched. "I'm cooperating fully. You're on your own." Sterling's career didn't end in that moment. But the mechanisms of its ending began spinning with the velocity of something that couldn't be stopped. The state medical board investigator, Linda Marsh, who'd initially drafted a report in Sterling's favor and then received a consulting fee he'd somehow arranged through a third party, she recanted. She provided evidence. She named names. 3 nurses gave statements about the escalating harassment campaign. The compliance officer who'd been considering burying Rachel's performance evaluation suddenly found her moral compass pointing in a different direction. MedSupply Solutions CEO, facing federal fraud charges that carried a sentencing guideline in the range of 7 to 10 years, decided that cooperating with the FBI seemed like a more attractive option than maintaining loyalty to a cardiac surgeon. The executive produced emails, invoices, digital records of the 40% kickback arrangement on every inflated invoice, going back for years. Sterling's medical license was suspended pending investigation on a Friday. He was terminated from Sacred Heart with cause on Monday, denied severance and retirement benefits due to the disciplinary circumstances. His wife, who'd spent 3 years not knowing whether her husband's bonus checks were coming from cardiac surgery or something darker, filed for divorce on Tuesday. 6 months later, Rachel Torres walked through the cardiac unit at Sacred Heart Hospital, and the nameplate on the director's office door read, "Rachel Torres, RN, Senior Chief Petty Officer, Retired, Cardiac Unit Director." Her worn combat boots, the ones she'd carried through Baghdad, through the years of invisibility, through the week of humiliation, sat in a shadow box on her office wall beside a photograph. The photograph showed 12 Navy SEAL operators standing at parade rest in dress uniforms, all facing the camera, all with their right hands raised in a salute. A salute to a woman who'd carried them home when her own country had ordered her to disappear. Marcus volunteered in the cardiac unit after school on Tuesdays and Thursdays, pre-med track, telling anyone who would listen about his mother with the unrestrained pride of a young man whose hero had finally been seen. Commander Halston returned monthly for cardiac follow-ups, always requesting Rachel personally, and he'd been making calls to the Pentagon about awarding her the Medal of Honor recommendation that had been buried in classified files for over a decade. And on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, Rachel drove past a strip mall on her way home from work and saw a man in a cheap polo shirt sitting at a folding table, the word supplemental insurance embroidered on the pocket in fading letters. His hair had gone completely gray. His face carried the particular erosion of someone who'd lost everything that mattered. She didn't recognize the man looking frantically at every passing shopper, trying to make eye contact, trying to sell policies that nobody wanted. Rachel didn't slow down. If you believe in the quiet heroes among us, the ones who sacrifice everything and ask for nothing in return, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Like this video and tell us in the comments, have you ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea what you'd survived? Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub saving lives in the dark.